Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another bonus episode of Blowback Season 3. This is the second part of our two-part interview with Korea scholar Bruce Cumings. Last time we spoke with Bruce about the lead-up to the war in Korea from the Japanese colonial period to the founding of the separate republics and the border clashes that were breaking out at the end of the 1940s. In this episode, we talk with Bruce about the actual breakout of the war, unresolved questions, what America knew or didn't know, the invisible hand of Chiang Kai-shek, and the ongoing intrigue over America's alleged use of chemical weapons in Korea. Enjoy. So this is interesting. I have a question here that was a little more sort of free form, but our first season was about Iraq, as I mentioned, and I'm thinking about the prelude to the Gulf War, when Saddam repeatedly signaled to the American ambassador that he was going to invade Kuwait, and we acted shocked after he did it and we tried to blow him away. And these are different situations, of course, but I'd be curious, given what you've said, and you've written about Goodfellow before, obviously. If you find this picture plausible, the North had plans to attack the South, perhaps in a limited way, perhaps for the full Monty. You can clarify that for us, maybe. The South, at the same time, as we've discussed now, was on record as eager to invade the North, and it initiated most of the border clashes, but the U.S. seemed to be keeping them restrained. And we know U.S. intelligence was not ignorant to a possible conflict, which I.F. Stone notes at the time. It didn't seem to warn or advise against this in any kind of public way to the North to prevent it from happening at the time. Then you have the John Foster Dulles visit. Anyway, do you think it's plausible that the U.S. strategy here, or some section of the U.S. government strategy, was to essentially wait for an attack from the North to happen and use that opportunity, quite knowingly, to unleash the South, now with international justification, and get rid of the communist state in the North, just stamp it out, rather than, say, have to mediate and live with a state in the North for years to come?
Well, what I think high policy in Washington consisted of was Dean Acheson's press club speech in January of 1949, which is constantly misinterpreted. I looked at his papers, his daily diary, the way he worked up that speech, and he was basically giving public airing to NSC 48, which had been approved by Truman at the end of December 1949. And you can see how he manipulated James Reston, famous reporter for the New York Times. After the press club speech, there's a first right column front page story in the New York Times where Reston is essentially parroting what Acheson told him. But in taking it all together, both the private parts, NSC 48 essentially applied containment to East Asia and Southeast Asia for the first time. But Acheson saw several situations that could erupt. One was the Korean Peninsula, but another, and particularly volatile, was Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan. The third was Vietnam, and a fourth was Iran. And he wanted to keep the Soviets and their allies, like Kim Il-sung, off balance. And he succeeded brilliantly, I think, he maybe didn't succeed brilliantly because the public generally didn't understand it, and most historians haven't understood it since. But he said something like, what we had to do was prepare for something coming through the line when we didn't know where it would be. Like a football metaphor, he's a linebacker, and it might be the North Koreans attacking, it might be Chiang Kai-shek trying to retake the mainland, it might be an offensive in Vietnam by the Viet Minh or the North Vietnamese. He also wanted to keep our wards, not really allies, off balance.
Syngman Rhee wanted to attack the north, so he couldn't give him a guarantee. Chiang Kai-shek wanted to retake the mainland. The South Vietnamese, might do something. So he had a situation where the provocation was likely to come from the communist side, he thought. I didn't mention that the Chinese were preparing an invasion of Taiwan. So it was just one of the contingencies he was worried about. And when it happened, he led the charge to intervene in Korea. But it was, in the first instance, intervening for containment to get the North Koreans out of South Korea. But in the summer of 1950, things slowly congealed to invade the North on a rollback mission. And rollback is mentioned several times in NSC 81, the National Security Council document that was approved in September of 1950. That was a stupid thing to do, but it was opportunistic. The only person who was against it was George Kennan. Dulles and a bunch of other high officials were for it. It's a dynamic situation where Acheson is trying to keep both the enemy and the ally guessing as to what the U.S. would do. I wanted to say something about American intelligence.
Please.
The one thing that we don't have is signals intelligence. And I will, have in my mind a hypothesis that the U.S. did see it coming through signals intelligence until I'm contradicted, until the materials come out. I mean, there were 14 NSA listening posts in South Korea at the time of the war. It wasn't the NSA, it was the Army Security Agency at the time, but it became the NSA. And there were also surveillance flights along the North Korean coast, photographing whatever they wanted to photograph. But that's about, that's the major source that we don't have.
Let's talk just a little bit more about the North's intent, and then the a little tidbit from one of your books, and then we can move on to the last couple bits here. You write in Korea's Place in the Sun, quote, "The evidence scholars now have," and I know this is from a bit back, so that's why I want to ask you about it now. "The evidence scholars now have, there is much more to come from unopened archives, is compatible with both an unprovoked North Korean invasion and with an interpretation linking the summer of 49 to June 1950, that the North, like the South, wanted to seize the Yongjin Peninsula and Kaesong and then see what happened next. It's many years on now. Do we have any more clarity on that issue? Have the archives shed any light on this idea?"
Well, the Soviet documents show that when Stalin, in January 1950, late January, gave backing to Kim Il-sung for an invasion, that it was a limited operation. It wasn't a general invasion. And then Kim, who was, his own man and impetuous, just before June 25th, he sent a wire back to Moscow saying it was a general invasion. They attacked with, they had about 100,000 troops, no more than South Korea, in spite of what people say. And 40,000 of them were the shock forces of the invasion. But I do think it was a combination of what you just said. It wasn't really, it was a much larger invasion than Stalin had expected, but it was, I think, an invasion designed to seize Kaesong, Yongjin, and march on Seoul and see what happened. And the collapse of the South Korean army was sort of like the collapse of the Afghan army last summer. The second division in particular just ran away. And the North Koreans paused for about a week after they captured Seoul. And I think that is a tip-off that
they weren't sure they're going to take the whole peninsula. I mean, if they got Seoul, that would be huge. But I don't think the evidence is clear enough. We have a huge collection of North Korean documents that were captured, and I spent 2 years going through that collection. It's fascinating on any number of issues, but there isn't, a Politburo set of documents where they lay out what they want to do. It's like Mike Tyson says, you have your plans until you get punched in the nose. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the funniest things that I'm sure many people don't think it's very funny, but Syngman Rhee ran away. I mean, he just took off, and the U.S. was trying to find him. And he ended up in Mokpo, which is a far southwestern port city. Also very interesting is that the South Korean elite made plans for exile, and about half of them wanted to go to Japan for exile.
Sure.
I wanted to say one thing that I forgot to say when you were talking about the guerrillas in Manchuria.
Yes, please. You
mentioned that in the Chinese Communist Party, 80 or 90% of the members in the guerrillas were Koreans, and that's true. There was a dissertation in 1999 that a brilliant piece of work that proved this. But what it did was it made Manchuria, which was already a kind of black hole in World War II. I mean, people just didn't know much about what was going on there. It made it even darker because the Chinese communists traced their lineage through the Long March and the Yan'an caves. And you hardly ever see any mention of Chinese communist activity in Manchuria. And the leader who became head of the Northeast government after 1945, Gao Gang, he was cashiered in the early 50s and executed for treason. So it's just been very hard to ferret out what happened in Manchuria. And yet, when you look at what the North Koreans have written about their own history, they've got it down to granular details about this town and that town. It's like the back of their hand. So you have a situation where most Americans and most people in the world don't know a thing about that guerrilla movement, which was really important in keeping the Japanese from going north and attacking the Soviet Union, and very important for the origins of North Korea. And yet for North Korea, it's their founding moment.
Two more questions about this key moment of the outbreak. Also in Korea's Place in the Sun, you write, quote, "We still do not know why the Pentagon approved and distributed in the week of June 19th, 1950, a war plan known as SL-17, which assumed a KPA invasion, a quick retreat to and defense of a perimeter at Busan, and then an amphibious landing at Incheon." End quote. Do we know why now? Is that at all clear?
No, that was very difficult to follow up. And I mean, like most scholars, when I finish a book, I don't continue my research. I just go on to other things. But there's no question that report was produced in the Pentagon. And it's so important about the Incheon landing because it shows that MacArthur was not clairvoyant, as everybody has said, but was essentially following a plan. The South Koreans also had a plan to pull back very quickly and draw the North Koreans into the South. I think that's pretty clear, but what isn't clear is the timing. And when I ask people about this, they say things like, "Oh, the Pentagon is always making war plans." And I would say, well, yeah, a week before the Korean War. I mean, it doesn't stand to reason.
Well, yeah, that's like, in our last season, we talk about like Northwoods, and people are like, oh, well, they weren't like serious about any of that.
Right. And the funny thing is, when you write a book and you say something like that, you expect that you will hear from people who know something, but you don't hear from them.
Well, I mean, there's a professor at I think Florida State, David Smith, who wrote an interesting book about like conspiracy theory, but he makes this argument that I found is like a useful, like intuitive exercise about like, like how tough is it to keep a secret? Like, well, consider how well the Manhattan Project was preserved, even Otto Fuchs considering, and how many people it touched, tens of thousands and so on. If the incentives are there. I mean, yeah, you've studied some pretty secretive places. One question that we had about the outbreak.
I just wanted to say about that, you're exactly right. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. used to go around saying, there aren't really any secrets in the government. Sooner or later they come out. And that is such bull. I mean, I'm teaching a colloquium for undergraduates on the CIA right now, and I'm using, among other things, a book called Poisoner in Chief by...
Yeah, we're very familiar.
And my hair was standing on end with some of the things I read in that book.
And that's a pretty sanitized version. Like that's a pretty... I mean, and not to say that it's like incorrect or anything, but just like it's pretty restrained in some of the details that it talks about.
Noah, just to jump ahead of your question for 1 second. The last thing I wanted to ask, we've established the plans of Northern strategy and the size of its forces. Just almost a detail. What do you make of these claims about specifically fighting at Haeju? With possible southern incursions where it was kind of unclear. Is that still foggy? Is it excuse making on the part of the North? What do you make of that specific idea?
Well, a number of people that I quoted talked about a regiment of the South Korean Army taking over Haeju on the day the war broke out, and I think that happened. But the question is, did they move first? And I mean, in the captured North Korean materials, it's just a ton of interesting stuff. But there's one document about the placement of landmines by North Korea. Now, here's another interesting secret. The South did not put down the landmines that the U.S. had provided to them. And the reason was they didn't want landmines in the way of their invasion. The North Koreans had mined the 38th parallel for years. But 48 hours before the fighting began, they picked up landmines north of Haeju and Kaesong. That's just very clear on the documentation and pretty clear that they implemented their plans for an invasion at the very last minute.
Yeah. I'm gonna lead into Noah's question here just a second to get us into that topic. Let's talk just a moment more about Formosa. What was Formosa's place in all of this, Chiang Kai-shek and his gang, and how did Formosa's value to the U.S. and China, for that matter, change as a result of the war?
And one dimension I'd be curious also is the, relationship and during this time, from the 40s into the 50s of the China lobby, people like Alfred Kohlberg and so on, sort of the Formosa issue, I guess, is it's a point for a lot of intrigue. So in addition to the strategic positioning, just kind of the character of it and how it related to American, I guess, domestic political intrigue, if possible.
Well, Peter Dale Scott wrote an article in the Japan-Asia Forum, I think it is, an online publication, where he used a lot of my evidence to argue that Chiang Kai-shek started the Korean War. And what I tried to do in my book was, if I found evidence that was important and shouldn't be, kept in an archive, but I didn't know the end point or what this evidence led to necessarily, I would bring it up. And maybe somebody would come forward and supply the answer to what this evidence pointed to. And on the last weekend in June 1950, several conspiracies documented conspiracies intersected. 50 Chinese made $35 million on the Chicago soybean exchange by cornering the market. There's no question that happened, but I.F. Stone and I are, I think, the only people who went into that. On the same weekend, the U.S. thought it was running a coup against Chiang Kai-shek. On Monday, the 26th of June, George Kennan says Chiang Kai-shek may be overthrown at any moment. I went to Taiwan and talked to people at the Academia Sinica. We had a little seminar on this coup, and they said that they didn't think there was much at their end that was happening. It was Americans, Washington, that expected that General Sun would make a coup. But I mean, Chiang Kai-shek had a PhD in intrigue and saw it coming. But General Sun Li-run, he was under house arrest until 1988. So something's going on there.
Could you talk a little bit about why air, like the novelty of this as a feature and as the determinant strategy, how it had evolved from the, end of World War II, and, what the impact on the ground was, like what that reduced the reality of North Korean life in places that were bombed too?
Well, let me come back to that in a minute. I just wanted to say one more thing about Taiwan.
Oh, please.
What Americans don't seem to be aware of is that in 1948, 49, 50, the State Department and the Truman administration said they were letting the dust settle on this Chinese Civil War. They were not going to back Taiwan for, forays onto the mainland or trying to retake the mainland. They were not going to give a defense treaty to Chiang Kai-shek. They were going to let the dust settle. Well, that's complete bullshit, because in February 1949, in a top secret meeting, Secretary of State Acheson said that we want to carefully conceal our desire to keep the island separate from the mainland. And then when the Korean War broke out, they put the Seventh Fleet in the Taiwan Straits and divided China, which is something the Chinese are completely aware of, but most Americans don't even know. And the only explanation for why the Seventh Fleet went in there was Dean Acheson saying, we don't want the island and the mainland to be unified. They wanted to get rid of the regime of Chiang Kai-shek, but they wanted to keep Taiwan basically in the Japanese economic zone, because they were reviving the Japanese economy, industrial economy, and they wanted Taiwan and South Korea and Southeast Asia accessible for Japan. But, a very good example of how top secret stuff can make a huge difference. So it was very premeditated to put the Seventh Fleet there.
Yep.
And about the China lobby, I could talk forever about those people.
Oh, man. I mean, we don't want to keep you here all day, but I would definitely love to follow up with you about that, because I've been trawling through some archives about it, and they're hair-raising and fascinating. I did want to return to the air war, though, just while we're yes. here, and sort of, to me, the framing and sort of way we're approaching it in our show is, in my, I previously I reviewed Malcolm Gladwell's horrible book for The Baffler, and my understanding of how the air war and the Korean War, the sort of, to Brendan had a free form question a bit earlier. I think this is kind of similar. The brutality of the bombing was a sort of, it was an applied lesson. It was a tactic learned from what they had done in Japan in World War II. And it was not designed for, strategic effectiveness and that it would diminish or destroy North Korean capacity. It was that it was, it caused incredible devastation and fear. It was meant to be demoralizing. And, I was kind of curious, I guess, if you could talk, is that accurate? If you
absolutely accurate.
Okay. And so then, all right. So we got that premise, what then was the human cost of it? Both because, on the troops and the mountains and everything, but, obviously then on, civilians and people, caught it. Not, and Americans would claim that this was, there had been this, strategic bombardment philosophy bandied about. Like, how did the Americans understand and articulate publicly what they were doing, contrary to the reality of of what was happening on the ground?
Well, the U.S. and Britain pioneered ways to raise a city to the ground in a few minutes. In 1943, they used napalm, thermite sticks banded together, and we're just pummeling Germany and Japan. I remember, for example, that Würzburg, which makes a great beer, was reduced to ashes in 14 minutes. Dresden is the best known example of it, but it was by no means the worst. And they took that whole apparatus of firebombing and oriented it toward North Korea. The U.S. had complete control of the air in the first year or so of the war, and they wiped out all the strategic targets, industries, military bases, things like that. They admitted they had no more targets, and they went on for the next 2 years, dropping incendiary weapons on villages and cities. Toll was just enormous. The North Koreans have never really provided usable statistics, but it seems about a quarter of the North Korean people died during the war, most of them from the air attacks. Soo-Kyung Hwang, who was a scholar at the University of Sydney, did a book called Korea's Grievous War, where she used archives from the U.S. Air Force to show, among other things, pilots coming back and vomiting after hitting a building that they thought, they were told was a target, and then they see a bunch of little kids come streaming out of the building on fire. It was doubly bad. I mean, I've become quite critical of the firebombing, that even though Germany deserved it, perhaps. Targeting civilians that way is just terrible in Germany and Japan, but in North Korea, where they had no means of, you didn't take your life in your hands bombing North Korea, whereas you did if you were a bomber over Germany, because they had excellent anti-aircraft and fighter planes. And I just think it's an atrocity.
I mean, does it rise to the level or fit the description of something like genocide, do you think?
I think it is genocidal in that it targeted a civilian population for, just time and time again. And it started at the top. I mean, Robert Lovett, who was defense secretary under Eisenhower, at a top level meeting, he says, well, we're making it very hard for the North Koreans. We're tearing up their society, but we should just go right ahead and do it. It's vicious.
There's one other, so there are two basic things, what was novel and so significant about the rapid accumulation of prisoners of war in South Korea beginning in the fall of 1950?
Well, what was unusual about it was that the POWs continued the war inside the camps. The North Koreans were very well organized, and they fought pitched battles with South Korean groups, mainly right-wing youth groups. And there would be a contest to try and get a POW to join a right-wing youth group or join with the North Koreans. And this culminated in the North Koreans taking a general, I've forgotten his name right now, but taking a general hostage and The U.S. responded to that with flamethrowers. It's killed a lot of POWs.
Well, that's also, I mean, that leads, I think, kind of nicely then to the sort of other side of the POW phenomenon, which is the experience of Americans in the North. And one of the things we're going to talk about in our show is, like have you seen this documentary that I guess it wasn't ultimately officially released, but of Ronald Reagan talking about the treatment of POWs in Manchuria?
I think I might have seen it, but I don't exactly recall.
Well, I mean, it's a pretty, it's a sort of marvelous depiction of, how how brainwashing works and all that. What was the significance, symbolically and, strategically, and maybe the strategy was perhaps in the symbolism of the POWs that the North did have. And then, in particular, the specific flyers who give depositions and make the allegations of biological warfare.
Well, the whole brainwashing business served to, completely cloud up the actual experience of the POWs. It was, just scared the hell out of everybody in 1953 and was used at the end of the war to explain why 21 Americans stayed behind when, in fact, I mean, scholarship has shown time and time again that there was no brainwashing. The Chinese and North Koreans engaged in criticism and self-criticism meetings with POWs and tried to proselytize them, but they did not brainwash them. They used sleep deprivation against the recalcitrant POWs who got in trouble for one reason or another. But it was a much more sort of predictable prison experience than you would think from all the hoopla about brainwashing. George Blake, British spy for the Soviets, he died a year or so ago at the age of 99. And I didn't know he had written that biography, and I got it and read it. And he was in a North Korean camp for 3 years. And what he describes is, a lot of lecturing, reading Marx and Lenin and so on, and unbelievable boredom, just endless.
Sounds like a good time to me. I don't know what he was complaining about.
General Dean says the same thing. Is like he was never tortured. He says this, but he's like, I was pouring through every odd book about the war, the Russo-Japanese War or whatever.
Right.
That's why. I mean, and then I guess one of the things that I don't know. Are you familiar with? Do you know of Thomas Powell?
Yeah.
So I interviewed him recently for a few hours, and I'm talking with him again this weekend. And have you read his articles?
I have years ago. I knew his father.
Yeah. So
I interviewed his father for our documentary that we did back in the 80s on the Korean War.
Oh wow. So I've been interviewing because Thomas has sort of taken up the trying to write his father's story into the public record, and I found it. And in reading that and then coming across the English translated depositions of the pilots and then the ISC commission, it seems like, there is this, long, perennial search for a smoking gun evidence that the U.S. deployed bacteriological or germ warfare. And what I've found in this is, I've not yet seen anything resembling a smoking gun, but the allegations and the reports are not as easily hand waved away as what the conventional narrative seems to have us believe. Based on the evidence that you've encountered and how you understand the contours of the historical debate, what is your perspective on the allegations? And then, regardless of whatever your perspective or interpretation is, what was the political significance of the allegations within the context of the war?
Well, as far as the airmen and their confessions, a book by Stephen Endicott and his collaborator that Indiana University Press published. I reviewed that book for the press, and what they did is establish a very plausible and documented venue for delivering germ warfare. They didn't have a smoking gun, as you said, to show that it actually happened, but it does, I think, prove that these airmen were not lying about everything, or tortured, or whatever, brainwashed. I've thought for a number of years that it was a black operation, fairly limited in scale, designed to sow panic among the enemy. I mean, it's a perfect example of what we were talking about earlier, that the government certainly knows how to keep secrets, and it has declassified very little on this matter. I mean, the fact is we live in a society where things like those anthrax attacks right after 9/11 out of Fort Detrick kill a bunch of people, and then you have an investigation, and somehow we never get to the bottom of what happened.
We mentioned that in our first season, as a matter of fact.
It's
a nice
Dr. Bruce Cumings, rest in peace. Pieces.
But Bruce, we so appreciate. I think we've taken enough of your time today. We'll let you go, but thanks again.
Thank you both. Have a nice weekend.
You too. Happy weekend. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.